Yugo awakens the ability to transfer his pain to others. So all the people and demons who laughed through his suffering mocking him are about to feel a world of pain as he shows them a long-buried memory he wished he would forget. Yugo found the situation deeply unsettling as he stood in the middle of a crowded place, glancing around uneasily. A voice behind him asked what was wrong, followed by a woman reminding him that it was time to leave for their restaurant reservation. He hesitated, responding vaguely, while another voice cheerfully mentioned that they were going to have a big feast and asked if he had come hungry. Someone else added that it had been a long time since the whole family had gone out together, while another wondered what kind of food they would be having. Despite their cheerful tone, Yugo's unease only grew stronger. He finally tried to stop them, telling his parents that they shouldn't go and that they should turn back. They brushed off his concern, telling him not to worry and assuring him that everything was fine. One of them even joked that he was just nervous because it was his first time at a French restaurant. Yugo insisted that it wasn't that, warning them that something terrible would happen if they went any further. Before he could explain, a strange redness spread across his vision, and a cold voice asked whether they really thought they could escape. Suddenly, the nightmare ended. Yugo jolted awake and reached for his phone, where a notification reported a disaster alert, an incident classified as Demonization Class C in Shermaine Prefecture. He stared at the screen in silence. Around him, notes were scattered across the room, evidence of all the preparation he had been doing. After a moment, he steadied himself and stood up, deciding it was time to change gears. Today was inspection day, and he needed to go to the company. He stepped outside into the crowded streets, paused briefly, then continued forward, repeating to himself that it was time to move on. One of the men remarked that if the product was selling well, they should simply increase the production lines. Another replied that doing so would require more manpower. The man with the weapon gave a short grunt, sheathed it, and turned away. Someone commented that merchandise production was progressing smoothly and that, thanks to the model, sales were rising steadily. The discussion continued briefly until another voice pointed out that increasing production would again require more workers. At that moment, another figure arrived, apologizing for being late and introducing himself as Fushimi Yugo, a field worker. One of the men immediately scolded him, complaining that it was Mr. Hakura's day and that being late was unacceptable. Yugo quickly apologized, but the man snapped back, telling him to stop apologizing and get to work. Nearby, someone muttered whether that clumsy guy was really a full-time employee. Another person replied that he was new, difficult to work with, slow, absent-minded, quiet during breaks, and always looked sleep-deprived. As Yugo began working, he mentioned that he would be assisting nearby. A woman acknowledged him with a greeting. However, someone warned him that if he kept showing up late, his pay would be docked. Yugo laughed awkwardly, thinking about how he would struggle to pay rent if that happened, and promised to be more careful. The woman, introduced as field worker Hanamura Akari, commented that he looked terrible and asked whether he was getting enough sleep. Yugo admitted that he really wasn't. Suddenly, a small blade nicked Akari's hand, leaving a shallow but visible cut. Before anyone could react, Yugo quickly produced a bandage and wrapped it around her hand, explaining that it was the kind that prevented blood from seeping through. Akari thanked him, clearly surprised, and asked if he always carried things like that. Yugo replied that it was simply a habit. Nearby, one of the supervisors remarked that Yugo's defining trait seemed to be how quickly he reacted to others getting hurt. Another man commented that he sounded like a natural do-gooder. The supervisor added that he was the type who earned goodwill easily. Later, one of the men called out to Yugo, inviting him to join the department for drinks. Yugo tried to decline and kept walking, but the man followed, joking that he wasn't getting away that easily. Yugo muttered that he lived far away and needed to catch the last train, silently thinking about how to slip away midway through the night. Even after arriving, he couldn't relax. The place was loud and filled with smoke, making him uncomfortable. Akari wrinkled her nose and commented that the air was awful, adding that this seemed to be Kono's usual hangout and that the customers there were rather rough. Kono soon joined them, teasing Yugo and asking if he was enjoying himself. He pointed out that it was Yugo's first time there and joked that he barely ever went out, calling him practically a shut-in. Akari immediately scolded him, telling him not to speak that way. Yugo awkwardly laughed it off, admitting that it might be true. Another man chimed in, asking if he avoided going out because of social anxiety or fear of demonization. The word made Yugo tense instantly. Noticing his reaction, the man laughed and said he must have hit the mark, adding that as long as someone avoided restricted zones, there was nothing to worry about. He teased Yugo for being overly cautious. Akari frowned at that and stepped in, saying everyone had their own fears and that it wasn't something to joke about. She added that some people had personal reasons and told the others to drop it. Taking Yugo by the arm, she suggested they go play darts instead. Another man asked if Yugo had ever tried it before, joking that he probably only played in virtual reality. Someone else laughed and said he was actually pretty good at 01. Just then, Yugo suddenly moved, pulling Akari aside. A dart flew past where she had been standing and struck the board behind them. Keno burst into laughter, saying it was harmless and that the tip was rounded. Another person joked that Yugo was trying too hard to look cool. Yugo quickly apologized, but Akari shook her head and said it could have been dangerous if it had hit his eye. Yugo looked genuinely startled, quietly realizing how close it had been. Another man scoffed and remarked that it was pathetic, directing the comment at Hanamura. He then turned to Yugo and told him to relax and enjoy the drinks, saying he looked like the type who would sit quietly and overthink everything. Akari shot him an annoyed look, clearly fed up with his attitude. Before anyone could respond, the door suddenly opened and a man dressed like a clown stepped inside. People around them stared in confusion, wondering if the place had hired some kind of performer. Keno approached him casually and ordered him to bring drinks, assuming he was staff. That was when everything went wrong. Without warning, the clown drew a weapon, and a deafening blast echoed through the room. Laughter, twisted and inhuman, rang out as chaos erupted. Kono's expression froze in shock before terror overtook him, his confidence vanishing instantly. The clown's laughter echoed again as he turned his attention to the others. People screamed and ran in all directions. Keno shouted for Fushimi to run, and Yugo immediately grabbed Akari, pulling her along as they fled. They rushed toward the exit, only to be met with a horrifying sight outside. The streets were filled with monsters. The sky burned red, and demonic figures roamed freely, attacking anything in sight. Screams echoed everywhere as people ran in panic. Some shouted for soldiers, others cried out in disbelief, wondering why this was happening when the area wasn't even marked as a danger zone. There were no soldiers, only monsters. Yugo and Akari froze in terror. This was exactly the nightmare they feared most. Even those who had been mocking and fearless moments earlier were now screaming and running in panic. Desperate voices filled the air, begging for help, pleading to survive. Some tried to fight back, swinging wildly at the creatures, but it was useless. Their attacks barely slowed the monsters, who seemed to enjoy the chaos, mocking their efforts as they tore through the crowd. Realizing there was no way to fight back, the survivors turned and fled in blind panic, shouting in despair that these things couldn't be hurt, creatures that felt no pain at all. Realizing there was no way to fight back, the crowd broke into panic. People screamed and ran in every direction, shouting that the creature couldn't be hurt and that it felt no pain. Some tripped and fell, begging not to be left behind, but no one stopped. The monster turned its attention to Keno and ordered him to stop. Trembling, Keno begged for mercy, but the creature replied coldly that it did not understand pain. Just as it was about to strike, someone grabbed its arm. Everyone froze. The one who had intervened was the very person they had mocked earlier, the timid, quiet man they had dismissed as useless. Yugo stood there, gripping the monster's arm tightly. The creature sneered, mocking him, but Yugo told it calmly that it hurt. The monster hesitated, clearly confused. Before it could react, Yugo struck, severing its arm in a single motion. Shock crossed the monster's face as it staggered back. The creature tried to recover, confused by the sensation. It had never felt pain before. As Yugo advanced, the monster attempted to retaliate, firing wildly, but its attacks missed. Yugo moved forward without hesitation, closing the distance. A system-like voice echoed, "Unique weapon, Vessel of Pain activated." Yugo struck again. Another message followed. Effect applied. Pain perception. The monster screamed, overwhelmed by sensations it had never known. Panic replaced arrogance as it tried to flee. Yugo pursued, his expression unwavering. He spoke calmly, almost coldly, stating that it was always the same. Creatures like this laughed while hurting others, yet couldn't endure suffering themselves. With one final strike, the monster fell. Silence followed. Akari stared in disbelief and called out his name. Keno, pale and shaken, demanded to know what kind of weapon that was. Yugo didn't answer. Instead, a message appeared before him. Record retrieved. Ground Zero incident, Tokyo, 8 years ago. Location, Shinjuku Ward. Casualties, approximately 320,000. Survivors, 8. The final line appeared slowly. First recorded survivor, Fushimi Yugo. Yugo lowered his weapon. This power was the reward he had received for surviving that day. A motorcycle roared through the streets, its wheels spinning at full speed as the rider pushed forward without slowing down. Over the comms, a voice asked for her current position. Rindo answered calmly that she had just entered Nagata and had ditched the helicopter, saying it was faster this way. The voice informed her that the demonization scale was classified as Class C, and that there were very few local soldiers available. They asked her to join the battle as soon as possible. Rindo replied that she would have ignored any order to stand by anyway. The voice noted that she sounded unusually motivated. Rindo simply replied that she had someone she wanted to pick up, an old comrade. Meanwhile, the city burned beneath a red sky. Amid the chaos, people had begun to cling to a new sense of hope. One of them, who had mocked Yugo earlier, muttered in disbelief that the reward last time had been a unique weapon, wondering what kind of person he really was. Suddenly, Akari shouted a warning as a group of monsters rushed toward them. Yugo reacted instantly, moving forward without hesitation. While fear overtook the others, he stayed calm. Keno froze in place, panic overtaking him, but Yugo grabbed him and shouted for him to move. They began running together toward a nearby commercial building. Yugo urged them to keep going, telling them they could survive if they made it there. The monsters, however, revealed a new tactic, launching rope-like appendages that snared several people at once. One by one, victims were dragged back. Yugo's expression hardened. Memories flooded back, memories of the hell he had once endured. Gritting his teeth, he activated his power again. Vessel of Pain engaged. With a swift motion, he unleashed a strike infused with piercing force, slicing through the restraints and freeing those who had been captured. He shouted for everyone to run while he held the monsters back. They fled toward the building, and even the last person caught managed to break free and follow. The doors slammed shut behind them. Inside, breathing heavily, Keno muttered that they were just rats cornered in a trap. Yugo told him to be quiet. Outside, the monsters gathered, their silhouettes visible through the glass. They didn't attack right away. They simply stood there, laughing softly as they advanced. Yugo watched them in silence, tension tightening in his chest. Then Akari whispered, her voice barely audible, asking if the monsters had finally given up. One of the men asked why the monsters had stopped, wondering if it was really just because they had run into a building. Yugo explained calmly that it was inefficient for the creatures to kill them there. Their goal wasn't simply to eliminate individuals, but to cause as much chaos and fear as possible in the shortest time. Sometimes they delayed finishing their prey on purpose, using fear to draw out more victims. Chasing a few people into a building wasn't worth the effort when there were easier targets elsewhere. Kari listened closely and then realized something. That was why they had avoided large buildings in the first place. There were fewer people inside, meaning fewer targets. Yugo confirmed it, adding that it also reduced the chance of attracting more monsters. Keno stood silently, watching him with disbelief. Only moments ago, he had seen Yugo as timid and unreliable, yet now he was calmly analyzing the situation as if he had experienced it countless times before. Akari turned toward Keno and asked if he was hurt. He looked down at his arm and admitted that it was injured. Yugo stepped in, telling him to calm down and explaining that the bleeding had already slowed. He added that within a demonization zone, people didn't die easily, not because they were protected, but because the monsters wanted their victims alive and suffering for as long as possible. He then gestured around them, pointing out how strange the environment was. Even though it was night, the area remained unnaturally bright, a trait common to these zones. Reaching into his pocket, he handed Keno a small vial and told him to drink it. It was a strong painkiller, something he always carried as a precaution. He assured him that if they survived, their wounds would be healed afterward as part of the system's reward. Keno hesitated before taking it, then asked why Yugo was going this far for him. Yugo answered simply that, in a place like this, survival depended on cooperation. If they didn't help each other, no one would make it out alive. Keno fell silent, then asked what they should do next. Yugo told them to listen carefully. As he began explaining the plan, Akari moved toward a nearby cabinet, searching for anything useful. She spoke firmly, saying that hiding and waiting would lead nowhere. They needed to prepare themselves for what was coming next. As everyone followed his instructions, Yugo continued explaining calmly. Inside a demon realm transformation, weapons could manifest just like enemies did. They tended to appear in enclosed spaces, lockers, cabinets, storage rooms. If they searched the building thoroughly, they would find enough equipment to fight back. He added that from this point on, the enemies would only grow stronger. Their behavior, patterns, and numbers would keep changing. To survive, they needed to increase their combat strength. That meant not only defeating enemies, but also gathering allies along the way. Surviving together was the only viable path forward. As they armed themselves, someone discovered a rifle bolt, while others found shotguns and basic firearms. Yugo reminded them that defeating enemies granted experience, and that gaining strength was essential to surviving the second phase of the event. Looking out through a window, window, they could see monsters still roaming the streets. Akari commented on how densely packed they were. Yugo nodded, explaining that many civilians had fled into nearby buildings, creating clusters of activity. Unlike earlier, when they had been overlooked, this situation was different, but also an opportunity. From higher ground, they could strike efficiently and link up with other survivors. He quickly assigned roles. He would draw the monster's attention first. When he gave the signal, Hanamura and Keno were to provide cover fire from above, while Hida and Motomi would attack from the lower floor. It was risky, but if executed correctly, they could thin the enemy numbers without being overrun. When Yugo moved toward the window to head out, Akari called after him, asking if he was sure he wasn't pushing himself too hard. He gave a small laugh and told her he was fine, that he was used to this. Watching him go, Akari finally understood the weight he carried. She stayed silent as he moved ahead. As Yugo advanced toward the monsters below, he assessed the situation carefully. Their numbers were high, and simple weapons wouldn't be enough. Against enemies like these, pain meant nothing. Only raw damage mattered. To survive, he would have to hit them hard and fast. Yugo explained that the enemies would continue fighting relentlessly until their vitality was completely depleted. Attacking them head-on was dangerous because, under normal conditions, they felt no pain at all. However, once affected by the vessel of pain, their nature changed. They began reacting like living beings, flinching when struck, developing vulnerable points where none had existed before. Weak spots such as the neck or core could then be targeted, allowing a single precise strike to finish them. His goal was to force every enemy into that state as quickly as possible. Choosing his target, Yugo focused his breathing. He muttered that he would rather not remember what came next, but it had to be done. As the vessel of pain activated again, a wave of distorted energy spread outward. Acidic rain poured down upon the monsters, burning into them and forcing agonized screams from their throats. Yugo rushed forward, shouting that the pain effect had spread to all of them and ordering everyone to open fire. The group obeyed immediately. The monsters panicked. This wasn't how things were supposed to go. They had come expecting to toy with their prey, not to be hunted themselves. As bullets and attacks rained down, their formation collapsed. Yugo charged straight through the chaos, knife in hand. When several monsters tried to surround him, he shouted for the others to keep firing without stopping. They complied, covering him as he pushed deeper into the swarm. Akari and the others, who had once doubted him, now followed his every command. Just as Yugo prepared to strike again, a monster lunged at him from behind. Before it could reach him, a shot rang out, blowing the creature apart. Akari lowered her weapon and called out that she had him covered. Yugo glanced back and acknowledged her shot. She shrugged lightly and said she had spent plenty of time playing shooting games. Keno, watching in disbelief, muttered that she clearly had more experience than she let on. Then something strange caught their attention. One of the fallen monsters began to glow. Everyone froze. Akari stared at it, confused, and wondered aloud if it was some kind of item drop. Yugo stepped closer, his expression sharpening. He confirmed it calmly. It was a rare drop. The chance of it appearing was extremely low, and it had just appeared for them. Everyone rushed toward the dropped item. Akari stared in disbelief and said that it had actually dropped something. Yugo explained that the golden glow meant it was a rare item and told Hanamura to open it. When she did, a small kitten appeared inside, meowing softly. She froze in surprise, and when she reached out, the kitten vanished. Yugo calmly explained that it had gone into her inventory. Items without an obvious function were usually key items, and she could summon it any time by imagining it. He told her to keep it safe. After that, he suggested regrouping with the others. When they returned, the survivors immediately gathered around them, expressing their relief. Many thanked them, saying they would never have made it without their help. Someone mentioned that there had been a nursing home nearby, and that they had barely managed to protect the elderly inside. Another voice joined in. Tagura had arrived. Keno reacted with visible relief, calling out his name and admitting how scared he had been. He even mentioned watching Tagura's streams, believing they would all survive now that he was here. Akari, however, frowned slightly and asked if things were finally safe now that a soldier had arrived. Yugo remained silent. In his mind, he knew the truth. Tagura had seen the swarm long before arriving. He had waited, watching the situation unfold before stepping in, but saying that aloud would only spread fear. Instead, Yugo simply told him they were glad he had come and suggested they discuss their next move. Before anyone could respond, a massive crash shattered the moment. A huge creature burst through the structure, sending debris flying everywhere. It was an elephant-like monster, clearly a high-level one. Yugo immediately noted that it had appeared without warning. No footsteps, no sound. It had spawned directly on top of them. Akari opened fire, but her shots bounced off uselessly. She shouted in disbelief as the bullets failed to pierce its hide. side. Yugo quickly assessed the situation and shouted that it was a defense-type enemy, telling everyone to aim for the weak points on its upper body. As the monster advanced, Yugo prepared to strike it down himself. But just as he gathered his strength, a sharp pain tore through his chest. Akari called out his name in alarm. Yugo clenched his teeth. The earlier use of acid rain had taken more out of him than he realized. He couldn't unleash a full-powered attack now. At best, he could still apply a pain debuff, and that might have to be enough. Yugo activated his ability and shouted the name of the technique as he lunged forward. The moment his attack landed, the monsters finally reacted. Real pain registered across their bodies for the first time. Keno yelled for Togura to do something, but Togura snapped back irritably, telling him to shut up. Despite his words, he barely moved, standing there as another monster was struck down. Akari stared in shock as the creature staggered. An elderly man nearby shouted in amazement that it had flinched, urging everyone to press the attack. Yugo took the opening and charged straight in, striking again. The monster roared in pain. Akari praised the old man's aim, and he laughed proudly, introducing himself as Gobi. Meanwhile, Yugo noticed several more enemies approaching from the side. He quickly assessed the situation and decided to engage them himself, telling Togura he would handle 2 of them. Togura scoffed, saying it would be easy, but when the monsters closed in, he barely moved. Yugo immediately realized something was off. As the enemies surrounded him, Yugo activated another technique, channeling pain through his weapon and unleashing a heavy strike that staggered them all. He pressed forward, striking again, pushing through the resistance. Even so, he could feel the strain building. The monsters were tougher than expected. He glanced back and saw that Togura still hadn't properly engaged. Instead, he was posturing, smiling confidently while doing very little. It became clear that his attacks were shallow, meant to look impressive but lacking real power. Yugo understood then. Togura wasn't fighting to win. He was putting on a show. The man suddenly began shouting loudly, claiming he was about to unleash a powerful technique. Spectators cheered, believing him. Togura raised his weapon dramatically, declaring the name of his move as if it were something legendary. Yugo watched silently, exhausted and irritated. The so-called attack was nothing more than empty theatrics. The monsters barely reacted. He realized then that Togura had climbed the ranks not through skill or bravery, but by pretending, by dazzling others with empty displays while avoiding real danger. As Yugo struggled to hold the line, he thought bitterly that there were only 3 people truly fighting here: himself, the girl behind him, and the young man holding the line nearby. Everyone else was just pretending. Everyone around them had already forgotten how to fight properly. Gobi muttered that it reminded him of the old days as he continued firing at the approaching monsters. He noticed that they barely reacted to the attacks and frowned. The elephant-type creature at least had shown signs of pain earlier, but now even that response was fading. Yugo quickly realized the reason. The pain debuff wasn't working anymore. He explained that those monsters didn't feel pain to begin with, and the effect was wearing off. Gobi scratched his head, saying he didn't really understand the technical part, but shrugged it off and told Yugo to fall back. He would take over for now. Akari protested, calling him reckless, and even Keno looked stunned, but Gobi only laughed and stepped forward anyway. With surprising confidence, he charged the massive creature and struck it cleanly, shouting at it to behave as if it were some unruly beast. To everyone's shock, the monster actually reacted, staggering backward. Yugo stared in disbelief. The old man knew exactly where to strike. Before Yugo could say anything, Gobi warned him not to lose focus. More monsters were closing in. As Yugo turned, he realized that Gobi wasn't just attacking blindly. He was controlling the flow of the fight, forcing the enemies into predictable movements. The massive elephant-like creature suddenly panicked and began to retreat. Gobi seized the moment, using its momentum against it, slamming it aside with overwhelming force. "This thing weighs over 5 tons, he muttered, almost casually. With a final strike, the creature collapsed. Yugo watched in disbelief as Gobi stepped back, breathing heavily. The old man then turned toward him and told him the rest was up to him. Yugo launched forward, striking down the remaining monsters with renewed momentum. Around them, the others stared in shock. Someone muttered that both Yugo and the old man were monsters themselves. Another whispered that Togura hadn't managed to defeat even one enemy. Togura, hearing this, stiffened in place. As the battlefield fell silent, a notification appeared before them. Initial sequence complete. Allocating survival rewards. Text continued to appear. Fushimi Yugo, strength +3, stamina +2, agility +3, spirit +4. Similar notifications appeared for the others as well. Gobi stretched his back and remarked that his pain was gone. Akari, still stunned, asked Yugo what exactly had just happened. Yugo explained calmly that it was a status increase, rewards granted for performance during the event. Before anyone could process it, another alert appeared. Large-scale structure detected. Emergency alert. All survivors evacuate immediately. The ground began to tremble. Something enormous was forming nearby. A moment later, a colossal structure manifested before their eyes. And then the final message appeared. Second sequence initiated. A notification appeared in the air. Task announcement. Prepare for combat within 900 seconds. Objective. Defeat the designated enemy, Ringmaster, at the center of the field. Details currently unavailable. Yugo read it carefully. So it's starting already. Akari read along and muttered that it sounded like a boss battle. Yugo agreed, adding that unlike games, there would be no retries this time. The old man sighed and told Gohei not to overexert himself, reminding him of his age. But Gohei brushed it off, saying the real fight was about to begin. He turned to Yugo and asked his name. When Yugo introduced himself, the old man laughed and introduced himself as Maroto Gohei, calling himself nothing more than a washed-up hunter. Akari introduced herself next, mentioning she was just an office worker who happened to enjoy FPS games. Gohei smiled warmly and greeted her back, then glanced toward the soldier standing nearby and commented that he didn't look very reliable. Yugo immediately defended him, explaining that the man was a Black Eagle rank soldier and that what they had seen earlier was nowhere near his true strength. He added that the soldier had deliberately held back so others could gain experience points. The man looked slightly embarrassed but quickly played along, claiming he had simply been preparing them for what lay ahead. He joked that it would have been troublesome if he had taken all the glory himself. The others relaxed, realizing that his earlier behavior had been intentional. Gohei laughed and remarked that it was clever, keeping up appearances while still doing his job properly. Yugo added that someone like him had a reputation to maintain, and if they framed things that way, he wouldn't be able to back out later. Akari smiled, teasing Yugo for being more calculating than he looked. Then a voice called out, addressing the soldier directly. Yugo turned and spoke up, asking him to gather capable survivors. At least 10 people who could still move and fight. There wasn't much time left, and they needed to prepare while gathering weapons. The man nodded in understanding and went to carry out the task. Yugo watched him go, then took a breath and told the others it was time to move. Akari glanced around nervously and asked whether it was really safe to walk through the open street like this. Yugo didn't answer immediately, but he kept walking forward anyway. Yugo explained that during the preparation phase, the enemies would not actively attack unless provoked. It was part of the system's rules. He then turned to Keno and asked if he was really all right, mentioning that waiting inside the building earlier might not have been the safest choice. Keno brushed it off, saying it didn't matter. If they failed the task, the outcome would be the same regardless. Yugo nodded and explained the consequence calmly. If the task failed, the sequence would shift into a penalty phase. A massive enemy would appear across the entire area and continue attacking endlessly. No matter how many times it was defeated, it would keep respawning. In such a scenario, civilian survival rates dropped to almost zero. In other words, failure meant total annihilation. That was why they had no choice but to succeed. Someone nearby spoke up, catching Yugo's attention. He turned to see a man studying him carefully. The man asked who he really was, remarking that Yugo didn't move like an ordinary civilian. When Yugo answered plainly, the man went silent for a moment before muttering that he had once been caught in the Shinjuku incident of 2030. Yugo froze, a survivor of Ground Zero. That explained the man's composure, and also why something about him felt familiar. When Yugo acknowledged it, the man cut him off sharply, saying he didn't want to talk about it. At that moment, Gohei pointed ahead. In the distance, the circus grounds were visible, overrun with grotesque figures in tattered costumes. Dozens of monsters roamed the area. Akari whispered that the numbers were overwhelming. Yugo nodded and explained that those were the Gatekeepers. The real battle wouldn't begin until they were eliminated. The enemies wouldn't move on their own during preparation, but once it ended, everything would rush them at once. He quickly began issuing instructions. Those with firearms were to spread out and secure firing lines. They were to keep enough distance to cover one another but remain close enough to provide support. He and Akira would handle any enemies that broke through the formation. Yugoro raised an eyebrow and asked if Yugo really trusted him with such a role. Yugo replied calmly that it wasn't about trust, it was about ability. He told him to focus on using his lightning attacks to stun enemies, since that was what he was best at. Yugoro smirked, realizing that Yugo had already analyzed his fighting style. He asked if Yugo was confident he could handle things if the situation spiraled out of control. Yugo didn't hesitate. He said it wouldn't be the first time. Then he stepped forward, walking straight toward the horde. The monsters noticed him and began to stir, some even laughing as they turned their attention his way. Yugo clenched his fists, steadying his breathing. There were more of them than before, but now his strength had returned, even the larger ones, and this time he was ready. As Yugo slashed forward, something suddenly activated above them. A system message flashed into view. By 1,000 arrowheads, pain of piercing. In the next instant, a rain of needle-like projectiles descended upon the monsters. Screams erupted as the creatures convulsed, clutching their bodies in agony. Yugo immediately shouted for everyone to open fire. The moment the pain effect spread, the monsters' movements dulled, and their formation broke apart. Bullets and attacks poured in from all sides. The creatures began retreating, shrieking in confusion. Yugo could see their vitality draining rapidly. At this rate, they would fall. Then several monsters attempted to flank him from behind, but Yugo reacted instantly, firing a lightning round that stunned them in place. Yugo acknowledged him with a brief nod, praising the support. Yugo grumbled in response, brushing it off as nothing more than luck. Another large presence emerged from the chaos. Yugo recognized it immediately, a massive elephant-type unit. He called out to Gohei, who stepped forward without hesitation. Gohei readied his weapon, calm and focused, and charged straight in. He fired again and again, each shot precise and heavy. He muttered that handling beasts like this was nothing new. Akari watched in disbelief and asked what kind of life he had lived. Gohei answered casually that he had spent most of his life hunting large animals. Compared to that, these creatures were no different. Yugo couldn't help but be impressed. He realized that entrusting such a powerful weapon to Gohei had been the right decision. With his support, their chances increased dramatically. The battle raged on until the last of the monsters fell. Silence finally returned. Yugo let out a breath and declared that they had done it. He even admitted that he hadn't expected things to go so smoothly. Looking at Yugo, he admitted he couldn't tell what rank he truly belonged to anymore. Yugo simply told everyone to move quickly before more enemies arrived. As they prepared to move, a sharp pain suddenly pierced his chest. Akari called out to him in alarm, and Yugo asked if he was alright. Yugo steadied himself and brushed it off, saying it was nothing more than a momentary wave of dizziness. He urged them onward, saying they needed to reach the designated area before anything else appeared. Even as he spoke, he could feel it, the strain building deeper inside him. Inside, the space stretched far longer than it should have. Decorations lined the corridor in an almost theatrical way. One of them muttered that the hallway seemed unusually long. Yugo explained calmly that spatial distortion was common during demon realm transformations. Gohei asked what kind of battle awaited them ahead. Yugo replied that it varied. Sometimes a single powerful enemy, sometimes groups, and other times complex encounters that required specific conditions to overcome. Akari glanced at Yugo and spoke carefully. She asked him about what had happened earlier, about the moment when he had stumbled. He didn't answer at first. She waited, sensing something deeper behind his silence. Finally, Yugo spoke. He explained that his ability, Vessel of Pain, reproduced the sensations of the attacks he had endured. Every time he used it, the pain resurfaced as vividly as when it first happened. The stronger the attack he copied, the more intense the backlash became. Sometimes it left him bedridden, reliving the trauma like a waking nightmare. Akari froze, realization dawning on her face. She whispered that it meant every wound he replicated. The slashes, the crushing blows, the corrosive burns were things he had actually endured before. Yugo didn't deny it. Overwhelmed, Akari turned away, her voice trembling as she asked how he could bear something like that. Yugo answered quietly, saying that this was simply the reality of that day in Shinjuku. He admitted that he had been terrified to leave his home afterward, haunted by memories he couldn't erase. Yet even then, he couldn't stop searching. Researching the demon phenomenon, trying to understand it, unable to turn away. Without warning, Akari stepped forward and hugged him. Yugo stiffened in surprise, unprepared for the gesture. She told him he was pushing himself too hard. He remained silent, unsure how to respond. Gohei cleared his throat, breaking the moment. He announced that it was time for a final equipment check before the upcoming fight. Everyone confirmed their remaining ammunition and supplies, hoping it would be enough. As they moved forward together, a voice echoed through the space. "Welcome, brave challengers, to tonight's performance." The air grew heavy as the presence revealed itself. Wisdom and courage, strength and resolve, flesh and blood alike, all shall be tested. The voice laughed. Designated enemy confirmed. Ringmaster, let the grand show begin. Gohei squinted at the figure ahead and muttered that it didn't look particularly impressive for a leader. Yugo, however, felt something different and replied that its presence alone set it apart from the others. The figure responded at once, its voice echoing across the space. It introduced itself as the one in charge charge and welcomed them to its performance. Akari wondered aloud if they should open fire immediately, but Yugo stopped her. He said they didn't yet know what the enemy was planning. His eyes narrowed as he studied the battlefield. The enemy's position was elevated, making a direct attack risky. If he tried to close the distance with a pain-based leap, he'd be wide open the moment he landed. Before he could act, the air shifted. A heavy pressure spread outward as an aura formed around the figure. From it, creatures began to emerge, large, red-skinned monsters radiating hostility. The voice rang out again, announcing the beginning of the show. Kari realized what was happening. The enemy was summoning minions. Yugo clenched his teeth. That explained its confidence. He turned to Yuguro and asked if he could use electricity to blind them. Yuguro replied that he could, but only for a short time. He suggested launching a preemptive strike. Yugo shook his head and told him to wait for his signal. Timing mattered. Suddenly, the monsters charged. Yugo shouted for everyone to scatter and activated his ability, launching a piercing attack straight toward the front line. The blow landed, but instead of cutting cleanly through, it met resistance. He realized too late the creature's hide was far tougher than expected. The monster retaliated, forcing him to block with all his strength. The impact sent a jolt through his arms. His tail lashed out next, nearly catching him off guard. Grinding his teeth, Yugo assessed the situation. The creature's hide was too dense for slicing attacks. He needed something heavier. Switching tactics, he channeled his power again, this time condensing it into a crushing strike. He slammed it down with everything he had. The impact finally staggered the creature. Seeing the opening, Yugo shouted for everyone to focus their fire on the same target. Akari confirmed and opened fire, though she noted how incredibly tough it still was. The battle had only just begun, and this enemy was nothing like the ones before. Yugo realized that blunt force was working, even if it wasn't enough to finish the enemy outright. He pushed forward and struck again, driving the creature back. More red monsters rushed in from behind, forcing him to turn and cut them down as well. Even so, he could tell something was wrong. The enemies were tougher than expected. Their endurance was far beyond normal. He noticed that while his attacks damaged them, they did not fall easily. From behind, Gohei fired his weapon and commented that if he aimed directly into the fur and fired at close range, the bullets penetrated, but it still took multiple shots to bring one down. The monsters were resilient. Then the ringmaster's voice echoed again, mocking their struggle as more creatures emerged. Akari cursed under her breath as the number of enemies doubled. Yugo realized they couldn't afford to hold back anymore. He acknowledged that this was no longer a situation where conserving strength mattered. Gohei agreed, stating that now was not the time for restraint. Akari scowled at the towering figure above, irritated by its theatrical presence. She compared it to a twisted performer mocking them from above. That was when Yugo connected the pattern. He realized the entire scenario mirrored the tale of the Pied Piper, the one who lured rats with sound. The monsters swarming them were no different. Understanding dawned instantly. He told Akari to use the item she had obtained earlier. She hesitated for only a moment before activating it. A small creature appeared, a cat, its presence immediately altering the atmosphere. As the creature moved, it began attacking the monsters with unnatural ferocity, tearing through them one by one. The surrounding enemies faltered. Fear spread through their ranks. Gohei stared in disbelief, remarking that the creature was even more dangerous than the wild beasts he had hunted in his youth. Sensing the momentum shift, Yugo gave the signal. Yuguro unleashed his stored power, releasing a surge of lightning that illuminated the entire area. The brilliance forced even the ringmaster to shield his eyes. That opening was all Yugo needed. He surged forward, closing the distance in an instant, and activated his ability. Pain surged outward as chains of force bound the ringmaster in place. The battlefield fell silent. For the first time since the battle began, the enemy had been completely restrained. Yugo pulled hard on the chain, forcing all of his strength into the motion. The impact sent the ringmaster crashing down into the ground. Without hesitation, he ordered everyone to open fire, and gunfire erupted from every direction. For a brief moment, it seemed like it might be over. Yugo watched the dust and smoke settle, his senses on edge. He wondered if that had finally been enough. Just as he signaled for everyone to cease fire, a voice echoed from within the smoke. The ringmaster emerged, unscathed and visibly delighted. He praised their coordination and composure, calling their movements refined and worthy of applause. According to him, their teamwork and timing were exactly what made the performance entertaining. He declared that the real show was only beginning. As the atmosphere shifted, a dreadful pressure filled the air. Something enormous began to take shape behind him, its presence bending the space around it. Yugo, Akari, and the others stared in disbelief as the figure continued to grow. The ringmaster spoke again, almost gleefully, remarking that they were about to experience something truly special. He compared it to a monster movie, except this time they weren't watching from their seats. They were part of the cast. A system notification echoed across the battlefield, cold and unmistakable. Designated enemy, Ringmaster, second form initiated. The air trembled as the transformation completed, and the true battle began. The Ringmaster announced that the real performance was finally beginning. With a mocking flourish, he shattered the ground beneath them, sending debris flying in all directions. Yugo and Akari sprinted away as the ground collapsed behind them. Akari shouted in disbelief, unable to believe that a second phase had already begun. Yugo called out for Gohei to aim for the flute as they retreated. Gohei acknowledged and prepared to fire. Yugo then ordered everyone to split up, telling them not to cluster together. They scattered in different directions just as the Ringmaster observed them with amusement, praising their ability to adapt and calling them impressive performers. Despite the chaos, Gohei managed to fire a precise shot toward the Ringmaster's face. The blast connected, but instead of anger, the Ringmaster laughed. He seemed delighted, remarking that their insight was admirable and that watching them struggle only made the hunt more entertaining. Eventually, the group managed to escape far enough to catch their breath. Yugo exhaled slowly, noting that they had barely made it out alive. One of the others muttered in disbelief that there was no way they could ever defeat something like that. Yugo, however, shook his head. He explained that the creature was defeatable. He pointed out that during the exchange, the Ringmaster had instinctively protected the flute rather than his own body. That reaction alone revealed a weakness. He went on to explain that the creature's behavior suggested the flute was its true core. The way it shielded the instrument, even at the cost of taking damage, made it clear that the body itself was merely a vessel. He also pointed out that during the earlier clash, the Ringmaster had shown no real signs of pain, even when struck by attacks that should have been effective. That indicated the body was likely expendable, a puppet designed to fight while the real vulnerability lay elsewhere. Yugo added that the term demonization always implied the existence of a loophole. These battles were never meant to be impossible. There was always a hidden condition, a rule that could be exploited. The enemy wanted them to struggle, to believe victory was impossible, only to mock them for failing to see the answer. And now, Yugo believed he had seen it. The flute was the key. Yugo explained that the very existence of such a scenario meant there had to be a way to overcome it. The system never created a completely unwinnable situation. There was always a flaw, a narrow opening deliberately left behind, something meant to give false hope while mocking those who failed to grasp it. Keno clicked his tongue, remarking that the designer behind it all had a twisted sense of humor. He suggested they move out and regroup at the designated rendezvous point once the fighting eased. As they moved, flashes of electricity lit up the area where monsters were being driven back. A voice warned them not to fire recklessly, reminding them that the director could hear everything. Yugo clenched his jaw, his thoughts spiraling. This wasn't a battle they could win head-on. Even with their combined strength, they only had a few capable fighters. Against something like this, it was suicide. Logically, the right choice was to retreat, prepare for the penalty phase, escape while they still could. He considered it seriously. If he ran now, he might survive. Pride didn't matter. Reputation didn't matter. Everyone else would likely die anyway. That was the rational choice. Then his gaze fell on the others. Why, he wondered, did they still fight? Why did they refuse to run like he was about to? What made them different? The answer unsettled him. As the thought crossed his mind, Keno shouted that they needed to move. Yugo snapped back to the present and answered, confirming that everyone was still alive. Gohei spoke up, pointing out that the flute was the key. If they could destroy it, the enemy would fall. Yugo acknowledged that observation. It matched what he had noticed earlier. Yugoro added that even so, landing a hit would be difficult. The enemy reacted instantly, and even a successful strike might not be enough to end it. Yugo thought carefully before responding. If the flute was truly the core, then damaging it should disrupt the entire construct. They had seen similar behavior before, objects acting as anchors for entities. And if it functioned like other artifacts, even partial damage could be enough. He concluded that the flute wasn't just an accessory, it was the heart of the enemy, which meant that if they could reach it, they still had a chance. Gohei muttered that if the enemy's massive body didn't actually matter, then there was no reason to fear its size. Yugo agreed, explaining that the body itself was only a shell. The real problem was finding a way past it. Akari pointed out the obvious problem. The enemy was far too tall. From the ground, There was no clear way to strike its weak point. Yugo remained silent for a moment, then said that if they couldn't reach its height, they would have to raise themselves to it. Gohei stared at him, confused. Yugo explained that they had two people capable of drawing the creature's attention long enough to create an opening. Their job would be to keep the monster focused while the others prepared the real strike. The priority was to protect the snipers and give them a clear window. Gohei muttered that the plan sounded reckless, but Yugo simply replied that there was no other option. He then mentioned that Keno had been sent off to scavenge for anything useful, as his condition made him unsuitable for frontline combat. Not long after, Keno returned, clearly shaken, holding something that gleamed faintly with a golden hue. Even at a glance, it was obvious the item was extraordinary. Before anyone could react further, the ringmaster's massive form shifted. It had noticed them. The creature turned, its enormous body casting a shadow over the battlefield. The moment it locked onto Yugo and Yugoro, it began advancing. Someone shouted in alarm as the ground trembled under its steps. The question of whether the building could withstand the impact lingered in the air. Yugo grimly assessed the situation. The structure wasn't collapsing. Not because it was strong, but because the creature's body wasn't as solid as it appeared. Its mass was deceptive, inflated rather than dense. That meant it could move despite its size, but it also meant it wasn't as durable as it looked. Realizing this, Yugo made his move. He activated his power, channeling everything he had into a single focus strike. The blow detonated against the monster, sending shockwaves through its body. The ringmaster staggered, and its flute cracked under the force. Yugo sensed it immediately. The pain response had triggered. He shouted for everyone to fire. Gunshots echoed as Akari and the others unleashed everything they had. The ringmaster recoiled, clearly affected. Then, with a distorted roar, it retaliated. The creature lashed out wildly, its massive form tearing through the surroundings. Yugo realized too late that it had locked onto the sound of gunfire. He yelled for Gohei to run as the monster's attack carved through the structure, shattering concrete and metal alike. Gohei barely escaped, laughing breathlessly as debris rained down around him. The monster continued its rampage, limbs lashing out in every direction. Yugo watched closely, noting how its form shifted and restructured with each movement. It wasn't just attacking, it was adapting. Gritting his teeth, Yugo called out for everyone to regroup. The fight wasn't over yet, and now they finally understood what kind of opponent they were truly facing. Yugo stared in disbelief at what was unfolding before him. The situation had clearly spiraled beyond what anyone had expected. Yugoro spoke with a bitter calm, saying that this was enough, that there was no point continuing. According to him, the outcome was already decided. No matter how hard they fought, they would lose. The only realistic option was to survive by abandoning the fight. If they simply ran and avoided the final confrontation, they could live. That was the only rational choice. He argued that survival mattered more than ideals, that clinging to pride or responsibility would only lead to meaningless deaths. In his view, escaping while they still could was the correct decision. Yugo listened in silence. Then he answered calmly, admitting that what Yugoro said wasn't wrong. He acknowledged that survival at any cost might seem logical, but he also said that he couldn't choose that path. He explained that when people die around you, something inside you dies with them. He had already lost too many. He still remembered the numbers, the overwhelming casualties, the near-total loss. If he ran now, then all of that suffering would be reduced to nothing. Everything they had endured would become meaningless. That was something he couldn't accept. He apologized quietly, saying that he didn't expect anyone else to understand. Then, without hesitation, he turned back toward the battlefield. Yugo moved forward, drawing his weapon as he re-entered the chaos. His body screamed in protest as pain flared through him, but he forced himself onward. He thought of Gohei, still fighting somewhere ahead, and refused to let him fall alone. Nearby, Akari continued firing, pushing herself past exhaustion. She noticed the ringmaster shifting its attention toward her, its focus sharpening. The creature's presence alone was suffocating. She realized then that its weakness, the flute, was still exposed, hanging openly. It was almost as if it wanted to be seen. But before she could act on the realization, the ringmaster turned toward her. Its hostility sharpened, its movements growing more deliberate. It began advancing, its killing intent unmistakable. Akari felt fear grip her, yet she forced herself to stand her ground. She shouted for Yugo, trusting that he would come. And somewhere amid the chaos, Gohei continued to fight on, battered but unyielding, refusing to fall even as the battle raged around him. The old man laughed as he charged forward once more, praising the young woman's courage and joking that if he had a son, he would want someone like her as his daughter-in-law. With that, he hurled himself back into the fight, moving with reckless confidence as he went straight for the ringmaster's flank. The ringmaster reacted instantly, swinging its massive weapon in fury. Yugo darted in, slashing at its legs. The moment his blade connected, the pain transferred through the creature's body. The ringmaster recoiled, clearly shocked. Yugo felt the backlash immediately. His body screamed in protest, and he realized just how dangerous this was becoming. Still, he pressed on. The ringmaster growled in disbelief, remarking that Yugo had dared to aim for its legs, and that such recklessness should have cost him his life. Blades rained down toward him, forcing Yugo to trigger another release of pain energy. The backlash tore through him, but he endured it. Even so, he knew he couldn't keep pushing like this much longer. Then, just as the pressure peaked, a massive explosion struck the ringmaster from the side. Electricity surged across its body, locking it in place. Yugo turned in shock. The one responsible was not who he expected. It was Keno. Keno shouted that he had barely made it in time, having found something useful while scavenging. He explained that what he had fired was a strange item he'd picked up, a coin that transformed into a projectile once activated. It had struck the ringmaster directly. Yugo realized immediately what it was. A rare drop, one meant to counter the enemy. The ringmaster recovered quickly, scoffing that such a trick would only delay the inevitable. Still, it was clear the hit had hurt more than expected. Before it could retaliate, another surge of electricity struck, this time even stronger. The air crackled violently as the blast landed. Yugo stared in disbelief as he recognized the source. It was Yugoro. He had returned, unleashing his power without hesitation. Yugo called out his name in shock, realizing that he hadn't run after all. Despite the chaos, one thing was clear. The tide of battle had shifted once more. As the battle raged on, fragments of thought flooded through Yugoro's mind. Memories of his past surfaced, of being told what he should become, of expectations forced upon him. He remembered being asked what kind of future he wanted, what kind of person he hoped to be. Back then, he had answered without hesitation that he wanted to protect people, to be a hero, not someone pretending to be brave, but someone who truly stood when it mattered. Now, standing in the chaos, he realized this was the moment he had always imagined. He shouted in frustration, half at himself, half at the world, cursing how ridiculous it all was. The electricity coursing through him burned intensely, but he kept going. The ringmaster staggered, clearly affected, yet far from defeated. The creature mocked him, claiming that such attacks were meaningless, that they would never be enough to bring it down. It boasted that these efforts were nothing more than shallow tricks. Yugo clenched his teeth. He knew better. Kano shouted his name from behind, warning him to be careful. Gohei added that the enemy's guard was still intact and that the flute remained protected. Just then, another shot rang out. Kari had fired. Her bullet struck true, forcing the ringmaster to recoil. She called out that she had changed her mind, that maybe, just maybe, Yugoro really was someone worth believing in. The ringmaster turned toward her, amused rather than angered, remarking on her courage. It raised its weapon, preparing to strike her down. Yugo's heart skipped. He lunged forward instinctively, shouting her name as the attack came down. His mind went blank as he watched the blow descend, unable to reach her in time. For a split second, everything seemed to freeze. And then, the impact landed. Kari was struck head-on. The impact sent her flying, and for a brief, horrifying moment, everything went silent. Yugo watched in disbelief as she collapsed, his body refusing to move fast enough to reach her. The ringmaster laughed, savoring the moment, delighted by the despair spreading across the battlefield. To him, it was beautiful, another life slipping away right before its protector's eyes. Yugo reached her just as her body went limp. Blood stained her clothes as she looked up at him, her expression strangely calm. She tried to speak, struggling for breath. He begged her to hold on, his voice breaking, but she only smiled faintly. She told him that it was all right, that he didn't have to suffer alone anymore. And then her eyes lost focus. Something inside Yugo broke. The ringmaster watched with clear satisfaction, remarking that despair always made the finest performance. He mocked Yugo for giving everything he had, only to watch the person he tried to protect slip away. Yugo could barely hear him. His mind went silent. He felt something inside him fracture completely, something far deeper than pain. It wasn't grief. It wasn't rage. rage. It was emptiness. The sensation that had once overwhelmed him, the agony, the fear, the despair, vanished entirely. Not dulled, gone. The ringmaster noticed the change and paused, unsettled. Yugo's body began to radiate a strange presence. The air around him warped as something heavy pressed outward, like pressure from a collapsing star. The ground beneath his feet cracked. The ringmaster frowned, confused. Something was wrong. Yugo lifted his head slowly, his expression devoid of emotion. The part of him that once felt pain, fear, regret, hesitation was no longer there. He spoke calmly, his voice eerily steady. He said that pain was something the enemy would now understand, that he would teach it what it truly meant. For the first time, the ringmaster hesitated, and in that moment, the balance of the battlefield shifted. As the aura continued to surge, the ringmaster felt something deeply wrong. His body began to tremble uncontrollably. A sensation unlike anything he had known coursed through him, an overwhelming force that invaded every part of his being. It wasn't pain as he understood it, but something far worse. He realized too late that what enveloped him was not an attack meant to kill, but something meant to make him feel. The pressure intensified, pressing down on him from all sides. His thoughts unraveled as the sensation grew unbearable. This was not something meant for creatures like him to endure. Yugo stood at the center of it all, his body radiating the power he had awakened. Tears streamed down his face as the pain he carried overflowed. It wasn't rage driving him, it was grief, a grief so deep it had hollowed him out. The ringmaster screamed as the energy engulfed him, unable to comprehend the suffering being forced upon him. To him, it was madness. To Yugo, it was justice. He told the creature that this was what pain truly was, that this was what it meant to lose something irreplaceable. The ringmaster's body convulsed violently, its form warping as it tried to escape the sensation. It screamed in terror, realizing far too late what it had provoked. Around them, everyone stood frozen. Then, suddenly, the energy collapsed inward. Yugo's body gave out. He fell forward, his strength completely spent. Keno rushed toward him, calling his name, while Gohei and the others watched in stunned silence. Yugo lay motionless, barely conscious, his breathing shallow. The battlefield fell quiet, too quiet. Then, from within the settling dust, a voice echoed. The ringmaster still stood. He laughed weakly, his body damaged but intact. He admitted that he had narrowly escaped death by discarding part of himself at the last moment. If he had hesitated even slightly, he would have been annihilated. Keno froze in horror. Gohei cursed under his breath. Yugo tried to move but couldn't. His vision blurred, his body refusing to respond. The ringmaster began to advance again, mocking them for believing the fight was over. Just as despair threatened to swallow them whole, a thunderous impact shook the battlefield. A new presence had arrived. A powerful strike slammed into the ringmaster, sending it reeling. A woman stepped forward through the dust, calm and unshaken. She spoke with absolute confidence, remarking that she had arrived just in time. Yugo recognized her instantly. Reno. She approached, surveying the scene with sharp eyes, and then glanced down at Yugo. She told him not to worry, that she had things under control now. And for the first time since the battle began, the overwhelming pressure began to lift. After striking the ringmaster, Reno assessed the situation calmly and remarked that if this was the last enemy standing, then the fight would end quickly. The ringmaster, however, was far from finished. Though badly damaged, it still managed to move, summoning more creatures in a desperate attempt to turn the tide. Reno clicked her tongue in annoyance. She commented that while the additional enemies were bothersome, they were hardly worth worrying about. Still, she decided to act efficiently. Activating her ability, she called forth the power of her unique weapon, a staff imbued with restorative and destructive properties. Energy surged outward as she activated Vital Infusion, restoring Yugo's strength almost instantly. Yugo felt vitality flood back into his body, his fatigue vanishing as if it had never existed. He muttered that it felt almost unfair how effective it was. Reno replied casually that it was working as intended. She then asked about the others. Yugo informed her that a handful of survivors were still nearby, some injured, others hiding. Reno acknowledged this and instructed that the wounded be protected while the rest held their ground. Gohei felt the pressure emanating from her presence and instinctively realized just how dangerous she was. When he voiced concern about the growing number of enemies, Reno simply dismissed it, stating that their numbers were insignificant compared to what she could handle. She moved forward without hesitation, charging directly into the swarm. The monsters barely had time to react before she tore through them. Her strikes were efficient and merciless, reducing the creatures to nothing in moments. She commented offhandedly that they resembled poorly made toys, remarking that she wouldn't even consider buying something so flimsy. With a dismissive swing, she cleared another wave. Yugo watched in awe as the enemies continued to fall. When another surge approached, he warned her, but she only laughed and activated her ability once more. A wave of energy surged outward, obliterating everything in its path. Keno laughed in disbelief, commenting on how absurdly powerful she was. Gohei, equally stunned, muttered that he had never seen anything like it. Keno explained that her weapon, the Staff of Ruinous Recovery, allowed her to convert damage dealt into healing and power, making her uniquely suited for prolonged combat. She wasn't just a healer, she was a frontline force. Reno, hearing this, remarked casually that while her physical strength had declined, her instincts were still sharp. She told Yugo that he had done well, praising him for holding out as long as he had. Yugo tried to protest, reminding her that he wasn't her younger brother, but she simply laughed it off. The ringmaster, however, was growing visibly unsettled. The tide had shifted completely. For the first time, doubt crossed its expression. It realized that the momentum was no longer on its side. Reno noticed the change immediately. She remarked that the creature was beginning to falter, and then calmly told Yugo that this was his moment. He was the one who had to finish it. Yugo hesitated only for a second before nodding. As Reno maintained pressure, he stepped forward, activating his power once more. His body surged with energy as the familiar sensation rushed through him. The pain was sharp but controlled. He charged. The ringmaster attempted to react, desperately trying to protect its core. It sensed what was coming and panicked, realizing too late that it could not escape. Yugo's attack pierced through its defenses, striking directly at its source. The creature let out a sound somewhere between rage and despair. It tried to retaliate, but the strike had already sealed its fate. Its form began to unraveling from the inside out. Yugo pressed forward, delivering the final blow. The ringmaster's power collapsed inward, its body breaking apart under the weight of its own corruption. Silence followed. Then the system responded. A notification echoed through the air, confirming the defeat of the designated enemy. The mission was complete. Rewards were distributed. Yugo felt power flow through him as his abilities strengthened. His body adjusted, his senses sharpening. Nearby, Gohei let out a low whistle, clearly impressed as he felt his own strength increase. Even Keno, stunned, flexed his fingers in disbelief as his wounds healed. Another notification appeared. Akari had received a unique weapon of her own. A faint light wrapped around her as the item materialized. Reno watched the scene with a satisfied smile. She commented that Yugo had done well and that he had earned the outcome. The shattered battlefield began to settle. The oppressive aura faded, replaced by an eerie calm. Overhead, the sky slowly returned to normal as the system announced the end of the event. Demon realm suppression complete. Survivors 48. Yugo looked around at the few who remained standing, battered, exhausted, but alive. And for the first time since it began, the world finally felt quiet again. If you like the story, then don't forget to subscribe and turn on all the notifications to not miss any more of amazing stories like this.